Close your eyes for a moment. Just let the darkness settle in. Now, imagine a hot, suffocating June night in Tehran. It is the year 2025. You are standing on a balcony, or perhaps just looking out from a window, and the sky is not silent. It is streaked with the erratic, terrifying flashes of explosions. The air raid sirens are wailing, a sound that drills into your bones. And there is a strange, desperate glow on the horizon where the darkness is being pierced by blasts. You check your phone, but the signal is flickering. There is no real shelter to run to, nowhere that feels truly safe. Morning comes, but it brings no relief. You wake up to a world that is slowly grinding to a halt. The power is out again. A rolling blackout that leaves the fridge humming a warm, useless tone and the fans motionless. You turn on the battery-operated radio and hear the news that a country across the region has just struck deep inside a wreck. It feels like the ground beneath your feet is shifted. On your way to work, if you even go, you stop for gas. But the line of cars snakes around the block, a sea of frustrating, tired faces just waiting for a few liters of fuel. You pull out your phone to check the exchange rate, and your stomach drops. It's over $1 million to $1. A simple loaf of bread costs 20 times what it did just a few years ago. It feels like the country is falling apart, piece by piece, right in front of your eyes. And yet, if you could zoom out, if you could pull your camera back from this immediate suffocating crisis, you would see that this is just one chapter in a story that stretches back thousands of years. The same plateau where these blackouts happened once saw the rise of the first true world empire. The same streets where people shout angry slogans today once echoed with world proclamations in Persian, Greek, Arabic, Turkic, and Mongol tongues. This land has seen empires rise and fall and survive conquests that wiped other civilizations off the map. So today, we're going to do something a little crazy. We're going to tell the entire history of the Ra, from the first civilizations that emerged on this harsh, beautiful plateau, all the way to this very difficult, complicated moment in 2025. And we're going to ask one question over and over again. What does it actually mean to be Iranian? Is it a language, a religion, a state? Or is it something else entirely, something that manages to survive all of them? But before we travel back, let's clear up a small but important point. Are they the same? Real yes and no. For most of history, the outside world, the Greeks, the Romans, the Europeans, called this land Persia, naming it after the region of Pars in the south. But the people themselves, for thousands of years, have called their land Iraq, meaning the land of the Aryans, a term that originally referred to a group of Indo-European peoples who settled here. It wasn't until 1935 that the ruling Shah formally requested that the world use the name Iran International. So the names are interchangeable in the geographic sense, but the history is one and the same. It is a history of resilience, of adaptation, and of a deep, almost stubborn continuity. Now, let's rewind. Let's fly past the satellite images of modern Tehran, back past the cars and the highways, back past the smokestacks of the 20th century. Let's go back past the railways of the 19th century, past the caravans of the Silk Road, until we reach the dusty, sun-baked horizon of the ancient world. We are landing in the middle of the first millennium BC. This is the plateau, a land of high mountains, vast deserts, and surprising fertility in the valleys. It is here that we meet the man who would start it all, Cyrus. Around the year 550 BC, a man named Cyrus the Great did something that seemed impossible at the time. He unified the various tribes of the Persians. But he didn't stop there. He went on to create the Achaemenid Empire, a state that expanded rapidly to swallow Anatolia, Egypt, the northern reaches of India, and the vast steppes of Central Asia. This wasn't just a local kingdom. It was the ancient world's first true world empire. It was a superpower unlike anything the world had ever seen. You can look at the maps comparing the borders of modern Iran with the map of the Achaemenid Empire, and the difference is staggering. Persia was a multi-ethnic, multilingual world state not just the nation-state we see on the map today. Cyrus is famous for many things, but perhaps nothing defines him more than the Cyrus cylinder. You might hear it called an early charter of human rights. Now, historians argue about that label. It might be a bit of a stretch by modern standards, but the symbolism is incredibly powerful. The cylinder records how Cyrus conquered Babylon, but did not enslave its people or destroy its temples. Instead, he allowed displaced people to return home and restore their religious sites. It was a style of rule built on tolerance, or perhaps a very smart pragmatism. Was Cyrus a benevolent ruler, a pragmatist, or just a smarter kind of conqueror? And why does his so-called charter of rights still get quoted thousands of years later? Maybe because it offered a different vision of power, one that didn't rely solely on the sword. After Cyrus came Darius the Great. If Cyrus was the conqueror, Darius was the builder and the organizer. He constructed the royal road, a highway system that allowed messages to travel vast distances at incredible speeds. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies. He's governed by a satrap who answered to the great king. And he built Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital that still stands in ruins today, a testament to the power and artistry of ancient Iran. Of course, we cannot talk about this era without mentioning the Greco-Persian Wars. In the West, movies like 300 have framed battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis as the ultimate climax of civilization versus barbarism. But if you look at it from the Iranian narrative, these were just border conflicts, rebellions on the western fringe of a massive empire. The Persians saw themselves as the center of the world, the bringers of order, but eventually the empire grew too large, too stretched. In 330 BC, a young Macedonian king named Alexander the Great dealt the fatal blow. He defeated the Persian armies, entered Persepolis, and famously burned it to the ground. The Achaemenid Empire was over, or so it seemed. But this land does not give up its identity easy. After the dust of Alexander's conquest settled, his generals, the Diadochi, fought for decades, tearing the region apart. For a while, the very memory of who built Persepolis seemed to fade. But from the ashes rose two new dynasties that would redefine the East, the Parthians and the Sasanians. The Parthian Empire, rising around 247 BC, was a different kind of beast. They were masters of decentralized rule, a confederation of noble families that made them incredibly difficult to conquer. They controlled the Silk Road, becoming a vital node connecting East and West, and they were Rome's greatest rival in the East. The Romans thought they were the masters of the world, but they constantly ran into a wall of Parthian cavalry. Then came the Sasanians in 224 CE. If the Parthians were decentralized, the Sasanians were the return of centralized imperial power. They revived Persian culture in a big way, promoting Zoroastrianism as the state religion. They became the Rome of the East, an equal superpower to the Byzantine Romans. For centuries, these two titans clashed in a struggle for dominance. But the Sasanians gave us more than just war. Zoroastrianism, with its dualistic view of good and evil, light and dark, influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam profoundly. The idea of a savior, a final judgment, and a cosmic struggle between right and law. All these threads can be traced back to the ancient fires of the Iranian plateau. But even the mighty fall. In the 7th century CE, a storm swept in from the south. The Arab armies, fueled by the new faith of Islam, conquered the Sasanian Empire. By 651, it was officially over. Iran began to surmise. Arabic became the language of administration and religion. It must have felt like the end of everything. The old gods were silent. The old dynasties were gone. Was this the end of being Iranian? Not quite, because something fascinating happened. In the 8th century, Persian forces helped overthrow the Umayyad Caliphate and establish the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasids moved the capital to Baghdad, and suddenly, the Persian bureaucracy and culture were running the Islamic world. But there was a pressure to Arabs to lose the old language. And that is where one of the greatest heroes of Iranian history steps in, Ferdowsi. Around the year 977 to 10, a poet spent 30 years of his life writing an epic. It was called the Shomime, or the Book of Kings. Ferdowsi used pure Persian to reconstruct the history of Iran, from the mythical age all the way to the Islamic conquest. He didn't write about religion, he wrote about kings and heroes, about the glories of the past. He is famously said to have revived the Persian language with his poetry. He turned history into literature and literature into resistance. If Ferdowsi hadn't spent those 30 years writing the Shomime, would Iran still feel like a continuous idea? Can a poem save a civilization? In Iran, it absolutely did. Ironically, just as the language was being saved, the land faced another wave of destruction. The Mongols, led by Genghis Khan and later Hulagu Khan, swept through in the 13th century. It was an apocalypse. Estimates suggest that 70 to 90% of the population in some areas was wiped out. Irrigation systems that had watered the land for centuries were destroyed. Cities burned. It was a dark age. Yet, even here, the culture survived. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol state in Iran, eventually stabilized and began to rebuild. And later, Timur, known as Tamerlane in the West, brought more destruction in the late 14th century. He was brutal, but he was also a patron of the arts. Through all this, Mongols, Timurids, destruction, the Persian language, and the Iranian narrative continued. Poetry, art, and religious institutions kept the flame alive. How many times can a country be destroyed and still be the same country? It seems that continuity in Iran is not about borders or buildings. It is about stories and language. By the year 1501, the landscape changed again fundamentally. A young leader named Ismail founded the Safavid dynasty. He did something that would define Iran to this day. He declared Twelver Shi'ism as the official state religion. Before this, you could be Sunni, Shia, Zoroastrian, or something else on this plateau and still be considered from here. But after 1501, being Iranian and being Twelver Shia became tightly bound. This was a masterstroke of identity politics. It created a sharp religious line between Iran and its Sunni neighbors, particularly the powerful Ottoman Empire to the west. The Safavids shaped the modern state of Iran with clearer borders and a capital moved to the magnificent city of Isfahan under Shah Baazwars. Isfahan became a center of art, architecture, and trade, a jewel that still dazzles visitors today. Was this religious fusion a clever survival strategy to resist the Ottomans? Or was it a division that still haunts Iran today? It's a question that echoes in the streets of modern Iran. Then came the Qajar dynasty in the late 18th century. If the Safavids were the peak of early modern power, the Qajars were the slide into weakness. Ruling from roughly 1796 to 1925, they tried to hold the country together, but the world was changing. The 19th century was the era of the Great Game, the strategic rivalry between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And unfortunately for Iran, they became the chessboard. The Qajars lost territory to Russia in the north and saw their resources coveted by the British in the south. The discovery of oil only made things worse as foreign powers vied for control over the black gold pumping from the ground. It was a century of humiliation, a sharp fall from being a center of civilization to a semi-colonial buffer zone. But this humiliation sparked something new, a sense of modern nationalism. You can see it in the tobacco protests of the late 19th century, where ordinary people stood up against foreign concessions. It was the awakening of a public consciousness. When you watch your country being carved up by foreign powers, do you respond by copying them, by fighting them, or by trying to reinvent what being Iranian means? The Qajar era forced people to choose all three at once. You can see this in the photographs of the time. Traditional turbans mixed with Western suits. Old newspapers using new words like nation and constitution. This tension set the stage for the Pahlavi dynasty. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan led a coup. By 1925, he had crowned himself Shah, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty. He and later his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, were obsessed with one thing: modernization. They wanted to turn Iran into a modern, Western-style nation-state, and fast. They built railways, a modern army, and a national education system. They banned the veil, promoted women's education, and tried to secularize society. In 1963, the Shah launched the White Revolution, a package of reforms, including land reform and women's suffrage. On the surface, it looked like progress, but it alienated the landlords, the religious clergy, and the traditional rural population, who felt their way of life was being attacked. And underneath the shiny veneer of skyscrapers and Western fashion in Tehran, there were deep cracks. Crucially, the memory of 1953 haunted everything. In that year, the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh had moved to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. In response, the United States and Britain orchestrated a coup to overthrow him and restored the Shah's power. This planted a deep-seated distrust of the West, specifically the United States, that has never really gone away. As oil prices boomed in the 1970s, the Shah grew richer and more autocratic. His secret police, Savak, ruthlessly crushed dissent. While the elites in Tehran enjoyed a cosmopolitan lifestyle, the poor and the pious felt forgotten and oppressed. The country was caught between two very different visions of the future. He forced the country to modernize in one generation without breaking something essential. The Shah was about to find out the hard way. By 1979, the pressure that had been building for years finally exploded. What began as protests against the Shah quickly grew into something much bigger: the Islamic Revolution. On the surface, it looked like a united uprising, but in reality, it was a strange and fragile alliance. Islamists, leftists, liberals, and secular nationalists all poured into the streets, not because they agreed on a vision for the future, but because they share one enemy: the monarchy. When the religious leader Ayatollah Khamenei returned from exile, he was greeted like a messiah. The Shah, once the symbol of modern Iran, fled the country. In his place, something entirely new appeared: the Islamic Republic, a type of government the Middle East had never seen before. Almost immediately, the new state set out to fuse religion and power. The Constitution introduced a concept called velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. In simple terms, it meant that in the Islamic Republic, ultimate political authority rests not with the people alone, with the religious leader and the clerical class around him. God, nation, and revolution were woven together into a single, tightly controlled political system. At first, many of the people who had helped overthrow the Shah imagined a different outcome. They had hoped for a freer, more independent Iran, a country less controlled by foreign powers and less repressive at home. Instead, they got a theocratic state, and it did not take long for the internal tensions of the revolution to become visible. The broad alliance against the king began to fracture. Islamists moved to consolidate power, pushing aside the leftists, liberals, and secular nationalists who had marched beside them only months earlier. Those groups were not just pushed out of government. Many were silenced, imprisoned, or worse. The revolution began to eat its own children. Then came a moment that would shape Iran's relationship with the United States for generations. In November 1979, militant students stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took more than 50 Americans hostage. For 444 days, the world watched as the crisis dragged on, ending only in January 1981 when the hostages were finally released. The hostage crisis hardened Iran's image in the West as a radical anti-American state. Inside Iran, It was celebrated as an act of defiance against the superpower that had meddled in the country's affairs for decades. But it also locked the two countries into a cycle of distrust and hostility that still shapes the region today. This is the turning point where many Iranians look back and asked, is this the revolution we fought for? The slogan had been independence, freedom, and an Islamic republic. But in practice, for many people, one tyranny had simply been replaced by another. The revolution had promised dignity. In many cases, it delivered repression. It had promised democracy. It produced a system where religious authority stood above elected institutions. The story of 1979 is a reminder that revolutions often do not follow the script their participants imagine. When a broad, chaotic uprising is eventually captured by a single, highly organized group, the result can be very different from what the crowds in the streets once dreamed. But the new republic did not have much time to consolidate its rule before disaster struck from outside. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, triggering an 8-year war that would shape the country's collective memory for generations. The Iran-Iraq War was brutal even by the standards of modern conflict. Front lines moved back and forth in bloody waves of attack and counterattack. Chemical weapons were used. Cities were bombed. Oil terminals were attacked. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million people, were killed or injured. It was not just a war between armies. Hilsi was a war against entire societies. For the Islamic Republic, the war became a tool of survival and legitimacy. The regime mobilized society with the language of martyrdom and resistance. Soldiers were celebrated as martyrs, and their deaths were framed as a path to paradise. This narrative was especially powerful in motivating young people. In one of the most controversial chapters of the war, thousands of teenage boys were recruited, often from poor and rural backgrounds. They were given plastic keys, said to open the gates of heaven, and sent to clear minefields or lead human wave attacks. You can tell this story calmly, without shock, but the ethical questions are impossible to avoid. What does it mean to send children to die in war? How far can a state go in the name of survival? The regime saw these young volunteers as heroes. Today, many Iranians see them as victims of a ruthless system. The war also left deep scars on the Iranian psyche. It produced a generation that grew up with the sound of air raids, the sight of destroyed neighborhoods, and the constant presence of loss. That trauma still echoes in Iranian politics and culture. And yet, the war also did something that revolutions often struggled to do. It unified a fractured country under a single banner. For 8 years, internal divisions were suppressed in the name of defending the motherland against a foreign aggressor. In the official narrative, the war became a sacred story of resistance against invasion, and the cult of the martyr became a pillar of the state's legitimacy. When the fighting finally stopped in 1988, Iran was exhausted. The economy was shattered, infrastructure remained in ruins, and an entire generation had been scarred. But the regime had survived. Against almost all expectations, the Islamic Republic had withstood not only internal dissent, but also a full-scale war backed by regional and global powers. In the years after the war, the state tightened its grip. Security forces expanded, intelligence networks deepened, and any hint of opposition was met with harsh punishment. At the same time, Iran began to project power beyond its borders. Groups like Lebanon's Hezbollah received Iranian support, building a network of allies that would become known as the Axis of Resistance in later years. Economically, however, Iran remained isolated and under sanctions. The combination of war, repression, and economic hardship created a society that was deeply resilient, but also deeply frustrated. Yet, even in this closed environment, culture did not die. Iranian cinema flourished in surprising ways. Directors like Abbas Kiarostami and Asghar Farhadi gained international acclaim by telling intimate, human stories that often carried subtle critiques of society. Their films showed ordinary people wrestling with moral dilemmas, injustice, and the complexity of life under pressure. In a country where open political speech was dangerous, art became a space where people could speak indirectly but powerfully. Literature, poetry, and music also became forms of quiet resistance. This tension between culture and politics became one of the defining features of post-revolutionary Iran, a state that tried to control every aspect of public life and a society that found ways to express its pain, creativity, and dissent in the spaces in between. So, in many ways, the Iran-Iraq War did true opposite things at the same time. It helped hold the country together in a moment of extreme danger, but it also locked society into a cycle of trauma and suspicion toward the outside world. The martyr narrative that once unified people in war later became a tool to justify repression in peace. War can make a nation, but it can also trap a nation in its own past. Iran, perhaps uniquely, is both of those things. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the map of challenges around Iran shifts again. In the 2000s, a new issue climbed to the top of the global agenda, Iran's nuclear program. Iran insisted that its nuclear activities were peaceful, aimed only at producing energy and medical isotopes. But many in the international community, especially Western governments, feared that the same technology could one day be used to build a nuclear weapon. Suspicion grew on both sides. Inspections, negotiations, and confrontations played out in headlines and diplomatic cables. This standoff led to multiple rounds of international sanctions, trade restrictions, banking sanctions, and measures targeting Iran's oil exports slowly tightened like a noose around the economy. For ordinary Iranians, the result was higher prices, fewer jobs, and the constant feeling of living under pressure. Paradoxically, the sanctions also fed into the state's narrative. Officials portrayed Iran as a nation under siege, surrounded by enemies and punished for refusing to submit. This story of being encircled and unjustly punished became a powerful tool to rally support and justify authoritarian measures. For a few years, however, there was a glimpse of a different path. In 2015, after years of on-and-off negotiations, Iran and 6 world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, widely known as the Iran Nuclear Deal or JCPOA. Under the agreement, Iran accepted strict limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For a short time, it looked like a new chapter was opening. Oil exports increased, foreign companies returned, and many Iranians dared to hope that their country might rejoin the global economy. But that hope was short-lived. In May 2018, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the deal and reinstated harsh sanctions. Even though Iran had been complying with the agreement at the time, other countries protested. But the damage was dark. Companies pulled out, investment froze, and the Iranian currency lost much of its value. The nuclear deal did not completely collapse, but its spirit was broken and trust evaporated. Inside Iran, the episode confirmed what many skeptics had always believed. You cannot rely on the promises of foreign powers. Hardliners gained ground, arguing that compromise had brought nothing but betrayal. Yet, even as the state and its enemies clashed over nuclear issues, Iranian society was changing in ways that had little to do with diplomats. This time, the driver was technology. Smartphones, satellite television, and social media seeped into everyday life, especially in cities and among the young. For a new generation that had never known the Shah or the revolution, these tools opened windows to the world. Young Iranians watched the same viral videos, listened to the same music, and followed the same trends as their peers in London, Istanbul, or Mumbai. A kind of double life emerged. In public, many people still followed the rules of the Islamic Republic, Dress codes, public behavior, and the red lines of politics. But in private spaces and online, a different self could appear. On Instagram, Telegram, and other platforms, Iranians shared fashion, music, comedy, and critiques of society with a freedom that did not exist on the street. Influencers, underground bands, photographers, and vloggers built audiences both inside Iran and across the diaspora, telling stories that did not fit the stereotypes often seen in Western media. They showed an Iran that was creative, diverse, and deeply human. This new, connected generation also began to express its frustration in more direct ways. Starting in 2017, waves of protests swept across the country. At first, the triggers were economic, rising prices, unpaid wages, corruption, and the feeling that the system was rigged in favor of elites. In 2019, a sudden increase in fuel prices sparked widespread demonstrations. The security forces responded with force, leading to hundreds of deaths in just a few days. The crackdown sent a clear message. Dissent would be tolerated only within narrow limits. But one event in 2022 marked a turning point. On September 16, 2022, Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman, died in the custody of Iran's so-called morality police after being arrested for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. Her death exploded into nationwide protests under the slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom." Women burned their headscarves in public, young people chanted against the supreme leader, and protesters from all ethnic groups and social classes joined in. Unlike earlier protests, these were leaderless, decentralized, and driven as much by a desire for personal freedom as by economic grievances. The regime reacted with its familiar mixture of limited concession and severe repression. Some laws were adjusted rhetorically, but on the ground, security forces arrested thousands, issued harsh sentences, and even executed some protesters. At the same time, the system showed a strange resilience. It allowed limited elections where different factions competed, but all within strict boundaries. It used social media not just to monitor dissent, but also to gauge public opinion. Analysts have pointed out that Iran's political structure, combining elements of electoral democracy with unelected religious and military institutions, has a built-in ability to absorb pressure without breaking. Internal competition between hardliners, pragmatists, and reformists sometimes helps diffuse anger by giving the impression that change is possible, even when real power remains firmly in the hands of a few. This raises uncomfortable questions. Protests have become a regular feature of Iranian politics, occurring almost every few years. Is this a sign that the system is failing and losing control? Or is it a sign that the system has learned to live with protests, treating them as a safety valve rather than an existential threat? And at what point does this dialogue through crisis stop working? How many times can a society go through the cycle of anger, explosion, and crackdown before something more fundamental changes? One thing is clear, Iran is not a monolith. Religiously, it is overwhelmingly Muslim, but there are also Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and others. Ethnically, it includes Persians, Azores, Kurds, Arabs, Baluch, Turkmen, and more. There is a huge gap between city and countryside, between rich and poor, between those connected to the global internet and those who are not. Any single label, Islamic Republic, resistant state, pariah nation, fails to capture this complexity. The future of Iran will not be decided by one group alone. It will be shaped by the tensions and negotiations among all these different Irans. All of these histories, the revolution, the war, the sanctions, the protests, crash together in the imagined, yet all too plausible, scenario of 2025. This is where the long-term trends meet the immediate crisis, and where history stops feeling like abstract background and starts feeling like everyday life. In June 2025, a shadow war that had been fought for decades suddenly erupted into open conflict. Over 12 days, Israel launched massive strikes on Iran's nuclear and military facilities, aiming to deal a crippling blow to the Islamic Republic's power and, perhaps, to weaken or even overthrow the regime. Missiles hit targets deep inside Iranian territory. Air defenses lit up the night sky over major cities, and the sounds of war replaced the usual noise of traffic. The strikes caused significant damage, but they did not topple the government. The Islamic Republic's security apparatus stayed intact, and its core institutions kept functioning. But the psychological impact was enormous. For years, the state had promoted a narrative of the resistance axis, the idea that Iran could project power across the region, support allies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and fight its enemies, all without paying a high price at home. The 2025 war shattered that story. For the first time in decades, large numbers of Iranians experienced war not as something happening on their borders or on television, but as something exploding directly above their home. The zero-cost heroism of the past suddenly felt like a dangerous fantasy. Fear, anger, and confusion mixed together in the public mood. In the aftermath, the international system responded quickly. At the United Nations, the so-called snapback mechanism was triggered, and sanctions that had been suspended for years came crashing back into force. The economy, already weak after years of pressure, collapsed. The Iranian rial, which had lost much of its value before, now went into free fall. From around 100,000 rials to the dollar in 2018, the currency plummeted to over 1 million rials to the dollar by 2025. On paper, this is just a number. In daily life, it means that prices in the shops change between morning and evening. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a kilogram of meat costs that had already risen sharply over the years, now multiplied again, pushing basic necessities out of reach for millions of people. And as if war and sanctions were not enough, nature added another layer of crisis. In the winter of 2024 and 2025, Iran faced severe drought. Rivers ran low, reservoirs shrank, and hydroelectric dams, which had long been an important source of electricity, could not generate enough power. The result was frequent rolling blackouts. In some cities, people went for days without electricity or running water, in freezing cold during the winter, and then in scorching heat during the summer. Hospitals struggled to keep equipment running. Small businesses, already hit by sanctions, saw their revenues collapse. Families sat in dark apartments, checking their phones for news, watching their savings evaporate. The social cost of his multiple crises is hardest to see in statistics, but easiest to feel in everyday story. The middle class, long the backbone of Iranian society, is exhausted. Professionals, teachers, engineers, and shopkeepers who once saw themselves as secure and respected are now squeezed between rising costs and falling incomes. Official unemployment is already high, but the young people, the real situation is even worse. A university degree no longer guarantees a job, and many who do find work earn salaries that cannot keep up with inflation. Dreams of buying a home, starting a family, or building a future have been replaced by the daily struggle to survive. And yet, the system holds on. It does so through a complex, multi-layered structure of power. Elections still take place, giving people a limited, controlled way to express frustration. Different factions compete within the elite. Hardliners, pragmatists, reformists, each blaming the others for the country's problem. Security institutions remain strong and willing to use force when necessary. At the same time, the state has learned to tolerate and manage a certain level of dissent. Protests are expected, even planned for. The regime absorbs some pressure, represses the rest, and continues. But there are signs that this strategy has limits. Voter turnout in elections has fallen to record lows. Many people no longer believe that voting can change anything. Street protest has become, for some, the only way to make their voices heard. At the same time, innate competition, while sometimes stabilizing, can also become a source of paralysis or unpredictability. The question hanging over 2025 is not just whether the regime will survive another shock. But what kind of society will emerge from this prolonged state of crisis? All of this brings us back to the question we started with. Who owns the story of Iran? Who gets to decide what it means to be Iranian? If you listen carefully, you can hear many different storytellers speaking at once. Imagine, for a moment, ancient Persian kings carving the victories in the stone of Behistun or Persepolis. In their inscriptions, they present themselves as chosen by the gods, rulers of the world, defenders of order against chaos. Their version of Iran is one of imperial glory, royal power, and divine favor. Now listen to another advice. The poet Ferdowsi, sitting in a quiet room 1,000 years ago, composing the Khamenei, the Book of Kings. In his verses, he stitches together myth and history, creating a continuous story of Iran from the beginning of time until the coming of Islam. He is not writing about dynasties alone. He is writing about a people, a language, and a culture. For him, being Iranian means speaking Persian and honoring the heroes of the past. His poem becomes a shield against being forgotten. Fast forward to the late 19th century. In the printing presses of Tehran and Tabriz, journalists and intellectuals are experimenting with new words, nation, constitution, rights. They publish in pamphlets, trying to redefine Iran not as a kingdom of subjects, but as a nation of citizens. In their stories, being Iranian is about law, parliament, and the sovereignty of the people. Jump ahead again to the 20th century, and a new kind of storyteller appears. The modern state. Under the Pahlavi Shahs, official propaganda drew a straight line from ancient Achaemenid glory to modern airports, highways, and factories. In museums, textbooks, and national ceremonies, the regime presented itself as the heir of Cyrus and Darius. In this version, Iran is secular, modern, and centrally controlled, a nation-state marching proudly toward the future. But then, another revolution brings another narrative. The walls of Iranian cities are covered with murals, posters, and revolutionary art. In these images, martyrs gaze down from above, fists are raised against imperialism, and Ayatollah Khamenei is portrayed as the savior of the oppressed. Here, being Iranian is inseparable from being Shia, Islamic, and revolutionary. The story is one of resistance against foreign powers and of sacrifice for a higher cause. And today, a new generation of storytellers is taking the stage. They are not carving stone or publishing pamphlets. They are posting selfies, filming vlogs, sharing music, and writing threads on social media. On Instagram, YouTube, and other platforms, young Iranians present a version of themselves that is personal, creative, and often at odds with official narratives. They show everyday life, humor, romance, frustration, beauty, and boredom. In their stories, being Iranian is less about ideology and more about lived experience. They are not asking for permission to define themselves. They are doing it anyway. So who owns the story of Iran? So the answer is everyone and no one. The ancient kings, the poets, the constitutionalists, the Pahlavi state, the Islamic Republic, and today's digital storytellers. All of them have tried to write Iran in their own way. Some have held power and could enforce their version. Others had only words and images, but their words survived long after the empires that built the palaces turned to dust. Iran's history is not a straight line from past to present. It is more like a spiral circling back again to the same themes. Empire and invasion, tolerance and tyranny, tradition and modernity, religion and state. Each generation returns to these old questions and answers them in a new way. What does it mean to be Iranian? Is it a language, a religion, a state, or something else that survives all of them? Perhaps the deepest answer is this. To be Iranian is to be the inheritor of an incredibly complex, resilient, and still unfolding story. It is to know that this land has seen everything before. Great empires and terrible defeats, foreign conquests and cultural revivals, dreams of utopia and realities of repression. And it is to understand that whatever crisis of the moment may arrive, whether it is a collapsing currency, a revolution, or missiles in the night sky, you are part of a story that is still being written. In 2025, as the lights flicker out over Tehran and the screens of smartphones glow in the darkness, that story is far from over. The only thing we can say for certain is that it will continue to be told, debated, and fought over. In carved stone, in poetry, in newspapers, in propaganda, and in posts and videos that have not yet been named. And that, in the end, may be the most Iranian thing of all to keep speaking, even when the world is listening, when no one is listening, and when the story itself is the only thing left that cannot be destroyed.